In the middle of an emergency board meeting at Harrington Global, CEO Victoria Harrington coldly fired Caleb Ward for stealing confidential files. No explanation was offered and none was accepted. The single father set his badge on the polished table and turned toward the door without raising his voice. But before he stepped out, he paused beside Victoria and whispered 4 words that would haunt her for months. "Don't trust your own family." The room broke into quiet laughter, and her older brother smiled as though he had already won. 10 minutes later, a hidden transfer of $30 million left the company under Victoria's own signature when she never remembered giving. If you want to know whether Caleb is protecting Victoria or setting a trap of his own, tap subscribe now and stay to the end because the secret changes everything. The emergency meeting had been called on the top floor of the Harrington Global Tower, where floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over the gray Philadelphia skyline, and the boardroom smelled faintly of expensive coffee and colder tension. Caleb Ward was escorted in without warning, still wearing the same gray suit he had worn to every internal audit meeting for the past 6 years. His expression gave away nothing as he took in the faces around the table. Victoria sat at the head, flanked by her older brother Graham and her mother Eleanor, while a dozen board members shifted in their seats. Graham stood first and tapped a remote that lit the screen behind him with a spreadsheet of download logs, each line stamped with Caleb's employee credentials. The logs showed a strategic acquisition plan for a regional shipping company, a list of Harrington Global's most valuable clients, and internal financial records belonging to the Harrington Family Trust. Worse fragments of that same data had already surfaced in the inbox of one of the company's fiercest competitors, a detail Graham delivered with theatrical disappointment rather than genuine surprise. Victoria asked Caleb directly whether he denied it, her voice level, her eyes searching his face for the flicker of guilt she expected to find. He answered without flinching. "The data passed through my account," he said. "I was never the one who used it." He repeated the distinction calmly, even as Graham scoffed across the table and accused him of stalling, insisting no innocent man needed such careful phrasing to explain himself. Eleanor leaned forward with the practiced gentleness of a woman who had spent decades softening hard decisions, urging her daughter to act before the family's reputation suffered further damage. Victoria, caught between the pressure of the room and the coldness her title demanded, announced Caleb's termination effective immediately, and slid a non-disclosure agreement across the table tied to a generous severance package. He read it once, then pushed it back, declining the money and the silence it was meant to buy. He collected nothing but his coat. As he reached the door, Caleb slowed just long enough to lean toward Victoria, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "You just trusted the wrong person," he said. "Don't trust your own family." Graham let out a short laugh and told the room a desperate man would say anything to plant doubt on his way out. Several board members chuckled along, eager to move past the discomfort. Caleb didn't look back. He walked out through the glass doors with the quiet composure of a man who had expected this outcome long before it arrived, leaving behind a room that assumed the matter was closed. 10 minutes after he left the building, Victoria's phone buzzed with an automated notice from the finance department, confirming a transfer of $30 million authorized under her own digital signature. She frowned at the screen. She had approved nothing of the kind that morning, and certainly nothing during a meeting where her full attention had been fixed on firing a man she barely knew. She had sat in that boardroom the entire time, phone untouched, hands folded in her lap. Whatever had just happened had happened without her. She called the finance department at once, demanding they freeze the transfer, but the answer only deepened her unease. The chief financial officer explained that the funds had already fractured into several smaller transfers, each routed to a different consulting entity within minutes of the original authorization. Graham was quick to place blame, reminding the room that Caleb had kept his system access until his credentials were formally revoked, and that a man freshly humiliated in front of the board had every reason to want revenge. Victoria wanted to believe him, if only because the alternative felt too unsettling to consider. But one detail nagged at her. The transaction had been authenticated from a device physically located inside her own private office, a room she had not entered since early that morning. She pulled the hallway security footage herself, scrolling the timestamps with Miles Keene standing quietly beside her, and neither of them found a single person entering her office during the window when the transfer occurred. Graham suggested the system logs were simply glitching and pressed her to sign an emergency resolution, granting him temporary control over all financial operations until the confusion cleared. She nearly agreed, exhausted, and rattled her pen, already hovering over the line when Caleb's warning surfaced again uninvited. She asked almost offhand who had first flagged his account for unauthorized downloads. Graham said cybersecurity had sent the report directly to him, a claim that seemed reasonable until Victoria requested the original file herself. What arrived in her inbox was a plain document with no digital signature from any actual analyst, no case number, no chain of custody of the kind that always accompanied an internal investigation of this severity. Miles Keene, the longtime outside counsel who had served on the board for over a decade without ever belonging to the family, pointed out that company policy required an independent investigation before any termination of this magnitude. Eleanor waved off the concern, warning that hesitation now would only make the board doubt Victoria's ability to lead. That night, alone in her office, long after the building emptied, Victoria pulled every report Caleb had filed over the past month, half expecting to find nothing unusual. The search returned empty, as though his recent work history had simply been erased. But buried in her own calendar archive in a section she rarely opened, she found a meeting request Caleb had sent weeks earlier, titled "Discrepancies in Payments Linked to the Harrington Family Fund." The meeting had never taken place. It had been canceled from her own account, though she had no memory of ever seeing the invitation, let alone declining it. Caleb returned that evening to the modest house he had lived in for the past decade, a world away from glass towers and boardroom politics, where the porch light flickered and the mailbox leaned slightly from years of harsh winters. He hung up the gray suit and set an unopened box of personal belongings on the kitchen table, unwilling yet to face what it represented. His phone rang before he had even taken off his shoes, and he saw his daughter Rowan's name on the screen, calling from her dormitory 2 hours away. He answered with forced calm, telling her only that he had lost his job, careful to keep the details vague enough that she wouldn't worry. Rowan, sharp as always, heard something beneath the measured tone and asked directly whether he had done what they accused him of. "No," he said, but sometimes the truth arrives slower than the accusation. Rowan was 20, studying architecture, and she had grown up watching her father carry quiet dignity through difficult years, first through her mother's illness, now through this. She told him not to sign anything and not to bother defending a reputation that didn't need saving in the eyes of the people who actually mattered. After the call, Caleb opened a small fireproof safe hidden in his closet and retrieved a folder he had prepared weeks earlier without telling anyone at the office. Inside were case numbers he had submitted to an outside auditing firm, timestamps documenting a pattern of irregular transactions, and a list of 7 consulting companies that had been quietly draining money from Harrington Global for years. Everything he had kept was chosen to avoid any accusation of impropriety. He held no confidential files, no proprietary documents, nothing beyond timestamps, case reference numbers, and publicly available business filings anyone could request through the state registry. That distinction mattered enormously because it meant every piece of evidence he possessed had come through entirely legitimate channels. An envelope arrived by courier just after 9 that evening, bearing the Harrington Global letterhead and containing a substantial severance offer, a non-disclosure agreement, and a clause forbidding any contact with Victoria Harrington. Caleb studied it closely and noticed something the board likely hadn't meant him to see. A preparation date stamped days before the meeting that supposedly decided his fate. That single detail confirmed what he already suspected. His removal had never been a spontaneous decision made in the heat of an accusation. It had been planned, packaged, and ready to deploy well before anyone accused him of anything. He sat at his kitchen table a long while after that, turning the folder over in his hands, thinking not of Harrington Global, but of the years before it, when he had built a quiet reputation, untangling fraud for companies far less forgiving than the one that had just discarded him. He thought of the promise he had made himself after his wife's illness, that he would never again let ambition pull him away from the person who needed him most, and how that same promise had made him careful rather than reckless when the irregularities first caught his eye. Then he picked up the phone again, dialing a woman he hadn't spoken to in nearly 2 years. Naomi Price answered on the 3rd ring, her voice carrying the same brisk efficiency he remembered from the years they had spent untangling corporate fraud, long before either of them landed at companies like Harrington Global. She listened without interrupting, asking the occasional clarifying question that revealed she was already building a case file in her head. When he finished, she confirmed something that made his stomach tighten. The whistleblower report he had filed 3 days before his termination had nearly been recalled by someone inside the company, an action that required specific administrative privileges few people held. Only 3 people had the authority to request such a recall: CEO Victoria Harrington, Vice Chairman Graham Harrington, and Honorary Chairwoman Eleanor Harrington. Caleb assumed the trail would lead to Graham, whose motives had seemed obvious from the first accusation in that boardroom. Naomi paused before delivering the detail that changed everything. The recall request had not come from Graham's credentials at all. It carried the authentication code belonging to Eleanor Harrington's private office, a woman who had spent the entire meeting playing the concerned matriarch while quietly pulling levers no one else could see. Victoria used a personal phone unconnected to any company system to reach Caleb 2 days later, asking for a meeting far from the corporate district where no one from Harrington Global would recognize either of them. She chose a small 24-hour diner on the edge of the city, the kind with cracked vinyl booths and coffee that never quite tasted fresh. Caleb arrived alone and unannounced, without a laptop or a single document, understanding instinctively that trust would have to be built through words before anything else. Victoria wasted no time. "What did you do with the 30 million that vanished under my signature?" Caleb didn't react with anger. He turned the question back with a calm precision that unsettled her more than shouting would have. "Who gave you the evidence against me?" She admitted that Graham had presented the report and that Eleanor had pushed hardest for immediate action rather than a careful investigation. Caleb began explaining what he knew: 7 shell companies operating under vague consulting contracts, entities that had collectively received more than $90 million from Harrington Global over 3 years, despite having no offices, no employees, and no verifiable services. One traced directly to Graham through a rental agreement on a vacation property. The other 6 had been buried under layers of paperwork designed to obscure ownership far more carefully. He told her he had tried repeatedly to bring this to her attention, requesting meetings that were mysteriously canceled every time until his own account was compromised and used as the conduit for the very leak he was blamed for. Victoria still wrestled with suspicion, wondering whether he was simply using her company's crisis to avenge his own humiliation. Caleb didn't argue past her doubt. Instead, he slid across a printed reference number for the independent audit filing he had submitted days before his termination, proof his concerns existed on record before any accusation had been made. The timing alone dismantled Graham's story, because a man fabricating evidence after the fact could hardly have filed a warning before it happened. Then he laid out 3 conditions before he would help delivered without room for negotiation: no use of Harrington Global's internal systems for their communications, no involvement from Graham or Eleanor under any circumstances, and every piece of evidence they gathered would go directly to an independent auditing party rather than staying within family control. Victoria agreed reluctantly at first, then with growing resolve as she began to grasp the scale of what had been hidden from her. Before he left, Caleb asked one final question that lingered after he walked out into the cold. "Who is the only person who always seems to know what you're about to sign before you've even read it yourself?" Victoria sat in silence, unable to answer. But somewhere beneath that silence, an image of her mother's face had already begun forming, unbidden and unwelcome. Over the following days, Caleb, Victoria, and Naomi built their investigation using nothing but public filings, careful never to touch anything inside Harrington Global's protected systems. They discovered all 7 shell companies shared a single registered mailbox address in Delaware, a common tactic for entities designed to hide real ownership from casual inspection. Each listed different nominal directors, but every filing had been submitted by the same law firm, one that had quietly served the Harrington family for well over 2 decades. One entity connected directly to Graham, its payments covering a lakeside vacation property and private jet charters that far exceeded his declared income. Victoria convinced herself at first that Graham alone bore responsibility of betrayal, painful enough without imagining anyone else involved. Caleb cautioned her against settling too quickly on a single culprit, pointing out that Graham might be a beneficiary rather than the architect. In every fraud case he had ever untangled, he told her the person who profited most visibly was rarely the one who had built the structure, because the true architects preferred distance and deniability over easy money. She resisted, insisting it was easier to believe one sibling had betrayed her than to imagine the whole family orbiting a single hidden hand. Caleb didn't push. He let the evidence keep speaking as it accumulated night after night across 3 laptops on Naomi's kitchen table. Naomi traced a portion of the shell company funds into a trust called Haven Crest Legacy, its list of beneficiaries deliberately shielded behind a separate legal wall. Victoria froze when she heard the name. Haven Crest was the estate where her mother had grown up decades earlier, long before marrying into the Harrington name. She tried to rationalize it away, suggesting someone might have chosen that name deliberately to cast suspicion on Eleanor rather than reveal the truth. Caleb didn't press her to accept anything before she was ready. He understood from painful experience how completely loyalty could blind a person to evidence sitting right in front of them. Through those long nights of digging, Victoria began to see Caleb differently than the file that had condemned him. She learned he had taken a role well below his actual expertise years earlier, choosing flexibility over ambition so he could care for his wife during her illness and later raise Rowan alone. Caleb, in turn, came to understand that Victoria wasn't the detached executive the financial press liked to portray, but someone who had quietly kept underperforming factories open to protect thousands of jobs. A purely profit-driven leader would have cut without hesitation. It explained in part why Eleanor so often called her daughter too soft for the responsibility she carried. One evening, Miles Keene reached out privately, revealing something he had found while reviewing old board records out of simple habit. A resolution passed 6 months earlier had been altered after the fact, its digital version differing from the paper original, still stored in his own files. The original document contained no language granting Graham emergency financial authority. The version now, in Harrington Global's active system, included an added clause allowing Graham to assume control whenever Victoria was deemed unable to perform her duties. Miles confirmed that the signature authorizing the change did not belong to Graham at all. It carried the unmistakable authentication of Eleanor Harrington. Just as their private investigation gained momentum, a business publication ran an explosive story accusing Victoria of funneling company funds into personal accounts disguised as consulting fees. Leaked documents bore what appeared to be her own digital signature, and within hours the stock price began a steep decline that rattled investors across the industry. Graham appeared before cameras, almost at once expressing solemn concern and promising the family's full cooperation, positioning himself as a grieving brother forced into an impossible position. The board called an emergency vote to consider suspending Victoria pending review, and Eleanor privately urged her daughter to step aside voluntarily to protect what remained of the Harrington name. Cornered and exhausted, Victoria confronted her mother directly about the Haven Crest Legacy Trust and waited for a reaction that might finally reveal the truth. Eleanor didn't deny recognizing the name. She framed it as an old charitable fund the family had kept for generations. Nothing more sinister than sentimental attachment to a childhood estate. Then, skillfully turned the conversation toward Caleb. He was exploiting Victoria's emotional vulnerability, she said. He had just been fired. He needed money. His connection to an outside auditor should raise serious questions about his motives. Victoria wavered under the weight of her mother's calm insistence, the same voice that had shaped her sense of right and wrong since childhood. Meanwhile, Graham arranged a secret meeting with Caleb in an underground parking garage, offering him $2 million and a comfortable position overseas in exchange for a signed statement claiming Victoria had directed him to conceal irregular transactions. Caleb refused without hesitation. Unmoved, Graham kept raising the number as though persistence alone might change the answer. Frustrated, he let slip that he knew exactly which university Rowan attended, a remark clearly meant to unsettle him into compliance. Caleb's expression didn't change, though something in his voice sharpened. "My daughter is an adult," he said, "and any threat toward her only strengthens the case against everyone standing in this garage." Graham backpedaled at once, insisting he only meant to reassure Caleb that his family would stay safe throughout the process. But the crack in his composure had already shown. Caleb saw it clearly. Graham was beginning to unravel under pressure he hadn't expected to face. When the board finally voted, Victoria was suspended by the narrowest possible margin, and Graham was installed as acting chief executive before the meeting had even fully adjourned. His first act was to order the complete deletion of every archived audit record within 24 hours, a decision he framed publicly as routine system maintenance rather than what it truly was. With time running short, Caleb remembered that older audit reports from years before had been preserved in physical form at an off-site storage facility outside the city, a detail few current employees even knew existed. Victoria and Miles drove there the next morning, racing the deletion order, uncertain whether the physical archive would still be intact. Inside dusty boxes labeled in faded ink, they found records dating back to the years when Winston Harrington, Victoria's late father, had personally overseen the company's finances. One folder revealed that Winston had grown suspicious of Graham years earlier, documenting concerns that his son was diverting corporate funds toward private investments without authorization. Winston had begun drafting plans to remove Graham from any position involving financial control, a decision he never lived to carry out. Tucked inside the same folder was a draft of a proposed corporate charter, one that would have fundamentally reshaped how leadership succession worked at Harrington Global. It specified that any chief executive would keep the authority to demand an independent investigation whenever irregularities arose, that no family member would automatically inherit executive power through birthright, and that leadership must be earned through demonstrated competence rather than bloodline. The charter had never taken effect after Winston's death, its absence never explained to Victoria in all her years running the company. Miles discovered that the final page of the original had been quietly replaced with an appendix granting Eleanor sweeping emergency powers under specific conditions. Naomi later confirmed through paper analysis that the ink and stock used for that appendix had been manufactured roughly 2 years after Winston signed the original charter, meaning it could not possibly have been part of his authentic wishes. Victoria stood in that dim storage room, forced to confront the possibility that her own mother had altered her father's final wishes after his death. She thought back to countless conversations in which Eleanor had insisted Winston always intended for Victoria and Graham to share leadership equally, a story she now understood might never have been true. Caleb didn't offer hollow comfort or rush to fill the silence. Discovering a painful truth doesn't decide who you become afterward, he told her plainly. Only what you now have the chance to build differently. Somewhere in the quiet exhaustion of that room, something between distrust and partnership settled into something closer to genuine trust. Caleb admitted almost reluctantly that he had nearly abandoned the fight weeks earlier, unwilling to drag Rowan through another prolonged battle that wasn't truly hers to carry. Victoria pointed out that he could have taken Graham's money, disappeared quietly, and let the whole thing collapse without him. Yet he had chosen instead to walk back into a company that had humiliated him publicly. That single choice, she admitted, was the first thing that made her genuinely believe him, rather than simply need him to be telling the truth. Buried at the bottom of the final box, they found a personal letter Winston had written to Eleanor, its ink faded but legible. "I know you're preparing to put Graham in Victoria's place," it read, dated 6 full years before Winston's death. Victoria chose not to expose everything at once. If Eleanor and Graham realized how much had already been discovered, they might destroy whatever remained of the hidden network before it could be proven. So she returned to the family estate and deliberately played the defeated daughter, apologizing to her mother for ever doubting the family's loyalty. Eleanor received the apology with practiced warmth, insisting everything she had done throughout the ordeal was meant solely to protect the Harrington legacy for future generations. Emboldened, Graham presented Victoria with a formal agreement requiring her resignation, a temporary transfer of her voting shares for 6 months, and a promise never to investigate past transactions again. She told him she needed time to consider it, though privately she had already decided exactly what she intended to do. While she stalled, Caleb and Naomi worked quietly alongside an independent committee formed from 3 board members with no family ties to the Harringtons. Miles made sure every piece of evidence followed a proper legal chain protected against any future accusation of tampering. Then, Victoria sent Graham a revised resignation agreement containing one carefully buried clause requiring all related accounts to be consolidated into a single central fund for audit purposes before any transfer of power could officially proceed. Convinced she had given up the fight, Graham skimmed the document and signed without reading closely. Believing his position secure, he ordered the immediate transfer of remaining funds from all 7 shell companies directly into the Havencrest Legacy Trust, unaware that this single order would finally create an undeniable, traceable link between himself and his mother's private accounts. Just as Graham began celebrating his apparent victory, he discovered that Naomi had been in regular contact with Miles throughout the entire process, and panic replaced his earlier confidence. He ordered Victoria's building access revoked, cutting off her movement through the offices, and began assembling a counter-narrative, claiming she and Caleb had conspired from the beginning to seize the company through manufactured evidence. Eleanor, sensing the walls closing in around her carefully built plan, called Caleb directly and asked for a private meeting away from cameras or witnesses. She offered to restore his position and clear his name entirely if he abandoned Victoria before the final confrontation. Caleb asked her plainly why a woman of her stature felt threatened by a single employee who had already lost everything. Eleanor's answer came without hesitation, in the same measured tone she used for every calculated decision. Because people who have nothing left to lose tend to say the things that should have stayed buried forever. Standing there listening, Caleb understood with sudden clarity that she had no intention of fleeing or hiding. She intended to walk into the final board meeting and cast Victoria as the sole architect of the entire scandal, exposing her daughter publicly before anyone could expose the truth first. The final board meeting convened with lawyers, independent auditors, and shareholder representatives, filling every seat, the tension thick enough to feel in the recycled air. Graham spoke first, laying out his case with practiced confidence, accusing Victoria of embezzling company funds, conspiring with Caleb, and fabricating evidence purely to reclaim the position she had lost. System logs on the main screen appeared to show Caleb logging into Victoria's private account during the exact window when the disputed transfer occurred. Caleb remained silent through the accusation, offering no immediate defense despite how damning the evidence looked. Emboldened by the silence, Graham demanded the board remove Victoria permanently and transfer full authority to him. Eleanor rose, next, adopting the wounded posture of a grieving mother, forced into an unbearable position, insisting she had only ever tried to shield her daughter from the consequences of her own reckless decisions. Then Naomi stepped forward with the results of her independent audit and methodically dismantled every claim Graham had just made. The login attributed to Caleb had occurred during a mandatory training session attended by more than 30 documented witnesses, making his presence at any computer impossible. The device used for the login didn't match any hardware Caleb had ever owned or accessed, and the authentication code used to impersonate him had been copied directly from the company's administrative server. Miles produced both the original paper resolution and its altered digital counterpart, laying them side by side for the room to examine. And the metadata embedded in the altered file traced the modification directly to a workstation inside Graham's own office. Graham insisted a technician must have used his machine without his knowledge, a defense that grew weaker the longer he repeated it. Then Victoria opened the very consolidation clause Graham had signed without reading, projecting it onto the same screen he had used to accuse her. Naomi displayed the complete flow of funds, tracing every dollar from the 7 shell companies into the Haven Crest Legacy Trust in real time for the entire room to witness. Cornered and visibly shaking, Graham could no longer deny that he had personally authorized the final transfer just days earlier. In desperation, he turned on his own mother, insisting he had only followed her explicit instructions from the very beginning. Every head in the room turned slowly toward Eleanor Harrington, waiting to see whether she would deny what her son had just revealed. She did not deny it. Eleanor rose slowly, straightened the jacket of her tailored suit, and addressed the room with the same composure she had held throughout the entire ordeal. "Yes," she said, "I did all of it, and I would do it again to save this company from my own daughter." The room stayed utterly silent, no one willing to interrupt a confession delivered as though she were reading a prepared statement rather than admitting years of calculated betrayal. Eleanor confessed without a trace of shame that she had spent years quietly assembling every piece of this plan, long before Caleb ever set foot in that boardroom. Victoria cared too much about individual employees, she said, moved too slowly to close underperforming factories, stayed far too soft in negotiations with partners who deserved no such generosity. Graham was willing to prioritize profit above people in ways Victoria never could, which made him the only child capable of steering the company toward the future Eleanor envisioned. The money siphoned through the shell companies had never been about simple enrichment. Though that had certainly been a welcome benefit, it had financed the purchase of loyal voting shares, funded the machinery of an eventual takeover, and quietly indebted several board members, who now found themselves financially tied to the Harrington family in ways they hadn't fully understood. Eleanor had let Graham believe he would eventually sit at the very top of the company he had helped her seize. In truth, she had always intended to keep controlling every decision from behind him, using her son as a convenient face for power she never planned to relinquish. Graham's expression shifted from panic to something closer to grief as he realized in front of the entire board that he had only ever been a tool in his own mother's design. Victoria asked her mother directly whether she had ever truly seen her as a daughter or only ever as a placeholder keeping the family seat warm until someone more suitable arrived. Eleanor answered without apology, insisting that anyone born into the Harrington name existed first and foremost to serve its legacy above all else. Victoria replied calm and even that this exact belief was precisely why the legacy needed to change immediately and without further compromise. The board proceeded to a vote revoking every remaining authority Graham had claimed, permanently removing Eleanor from any position of influence and reinstating Victoria as chief executive with unanimous support. All relevant financial records were ordered transferred directly to federal investigators outside the company's control. Victoria refused to bury the scandal quietly to protect the family name, choosing instead to release the full findings of the independent audit publicly, despite warnings that the stock might fall even further. As a result, Caleb was formally and publicly cleared of every accusation that had ended his career weeks earlier, his name restored without qualification. Graham was escorted from the building alongside his legal counsel, the departure quiet and orderly. Eleanor left the tower in complete silence, her posture unbroken, still apparently convinced everything she had done had been justified. As the room emptied, Victoria turned to Caleb and asked the question that had sat unspoken between them for weeks. "Why did you warn me right after I had just destroyed your reputation in front of everyone you worked with?" Caleb considered it only a moment, because the truth doesn't require the person receiving it to deserve it first. Several months later, Harrington Global released the complete findings of its internal audit to the public, laying out every detail without omission or spin. Much of the stolen money was recovered through coordinated legal action, and the company implemented sweeping structural reforms designed to prevent anything similar from happening again. Family members would no longer receive automatic exemption from routine audits, regardless of their standing. No chief executive would ever again hold unilateral power to terminate an employee who came forward with a legitimate concern. Every major transaction now required explicit confirmation from a fully independent committee, and whistleblower reports were routed automatically to that committee rather than passing first through executive hands where they could quietly disappear. The changes drew skepticism from some investors who worried the new layers of oversight would slow decisions. Victoria argued publicly that a company built on secrecy had already proven how expensive that could become. Employees who had watched the scandal unfold from a distance began to speak more openly in internal meetings, no longer afraid that raising a concern might cost them their livelihood, the way it had nearly cost Caleb his. Victoria stood before the assembled staff and publicly apologized to Caleb, acknowledging without hesitation that she had chosen bloodline over evidence when it mattered most. She admitted the mistake, openly refusing to soften it with excuses about the pressure she had been under. Caleb never asked for excessive compensation, nor did he pursue retaliation against anyone who had wronged him. Victoria offered to bring him back in a newly created role overseeing integrity and risk management across the entire organization, and he agreed only under specific conditions meant to keep history from repeating itself. The position would report directly to the Independent Oversight Committee rather than to the chief executive alone. No single leader would ever again have unchecked power to override or dismiss him without cause, and anyone who came forward with a legitimate concern would receive formal protection under the very framework he now helped design and enforce. Victoria agreed to every condition without argument, understanding exactly why each one mattered after everything they had endured. Rowan crossed the stage at her graduation that spring, Caleb watching proudly from the audience in her cap and gown. Victoria attended too, arriving quietly without any entourage or press. Afterward, she thanked Rowan sincerely for sharing her father with a company that had for a time proven itself entirely unworthy of him. Rowan laughed and warned her not to assume her father forgave easily just because he seemed calm on the surface. Later, the two of them sat together at a small coffee shop near campus, the conversation drifting without the weight of titles or corporate formality. For the first time since they had met, they spoke simply as two people who had seen each other's most vulnerable moments and chosen honesty. Victoria asked whether he still believed family itself was something inherently dangerous after everything his warning had set in motion. Caleb shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "I only believe that bloodline can never replace loyalty." Watching Rowan laugh with her friends across the courtyard, Victoria understood clearly that Caleb had built something more meaningful than any inheritance could provide. A family shaped entirely by love rather than power or obligation. The story closed weeks later when Victoria received a new audit report from Caleb's office delivered exactly on schedule as it always was. Written across the cover in his familiar handwriting was a single line that captured everything the company had rebuilt since that whispered warning first echoed through a crowded boardroom. No exceptions, it read, not even for the chief executive. Victoria smiled quietly to herself and signed the audit confirmation without hesitation. Caleb Ward had once been fired for daring to speak an inconvenient truth aloud. In the end, that same truth was the only thing that saved Victoria from the family she trusted most and saved Harrington Global from the very name that had built it in the first place. So here's my question for you before you go. If a stranger warned you about the people closest to you, the ones you'd never think to doubt, would you have listened or would you have laughed the way that boardroom did? Tell me in the comments, and if this story kept you guessing to the end, subscribe so the next one finds you. I read every reply.